Hello, loud teachers and students. Welcome to Learning is Not Quiet presents Cells and the Organelles that make them. Today, we're going to talk all about the pieces that make up cells and how they work to help the cell carry out all of the things that we need it to do to help us survive. In this video and in this lesson, I'm not going to be talking about prokaryotic or bacteria cells. I am going to be focusing mostly on animal cells with a little bit of plant cell stuff thrown in. This is my puppy bruschetta. So yeah, these are the kinds of cells that are found in you, cutie, and inside of me. And you're mostly included in this video because you will not stop barking and licking around to allow me to record. So animal cells is the main focus of this lesson. With that, some housekeeping notes. If you are a parent or a teacher and are interested in purchasing the digital or paper versions of these notes that come along with it, including differentiations for students who might struggle with this level of filling out note sheets, and it's also translated into Spanish with a Spanish version of this Prezi. Also, there are links to other resources that you might find helpful, including task cards, projects, and whole bundles of lab experiments and fun activities. Students, please note that if I emphasize or if you see words in all capital letters, that is likely something that is very important that you need to pay attention to. That is probably the answer to a multiple choice question or a fill in the blank if you have the paper version. Let's get started. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is what is an organelle, or what are organelles in general. So cells are the building blocks of life, but what makes up cells? Organelles are smaller pieces of cells that have a specific function to help a cell carry out all of the things that a cell needs to do. So just a couple kind of key vocab words there. Function means what the cell is doing, right? What the organelle is doing to help that cell carry out its function. And when I think of bruschetta here, she has different organs, right? She has ears to help her hear. She has eyes to help her see. She has a nose to help her smell and get in trouble. Those are organs that all come together to make up bruschetta, right? I can't separate her nose from the rest of her body. And that's a very good thing for you and for me. But inside of each of those organs are many, many cells. And each of those cells has organelles, or even smaller organs that help those cells carry out their functions. So we're diving deeper and deeper and deeper and smaller and smaller and smaller into what a cell actually is and how it does the things that it does. Okay, so turn, pair, share to review. If you're in class, you can do that. If you're at home, just think for a second to yourself, what are the various jobs that a cell has? Use your knowledge of the characteristics of living things. All right, so I'm going to continue on. Hopefully you've had a chance to think about, write about, or talk about it with a partner in the room. Moving on. We're now going to talk about what an analogy is. In a lot of ways, cells are like our school. In an analogy, an example or comparison between two things that related to their function. In a lot of ways, a cell is like our school because a lot of organelles have the same function as different things in our school. So basically, it's hard to imagine what happens inside of a cell because it's so small and we can't just walk down the street and experience it in our everyday life. Even though cells are making up you, me, and everything that's living around us, it's hard to visualize what those organelles look like and what their function is. So that's why I'm going to relate them to a school in an analogy, in a comparison. So now we're going to talk about maybe the most important organelle or little body part of the cell, which is the nucleus. The nucleus of the cell is like the control center. It tells the rest of the organelles what to do and stores the DNA of the cell. Quick review, DNA is the deoxyribonucleic acid, or the instructions, the blueprint, the thing that gives information and holds the genetic material of any living thing. And so this is kind of a loose diagram of a cell, but that big circular thing in the center is the nucleus. And fun fact, inside of the nucleus is the nucleolus. The principle is a lot like the nucleus of the cell. If we think of our school as a cell, this is the principle of the cell. The nucleus job is to help regulate all of the other organelles and store DNA, or the blueprints. And that's kind of what the principal does, right? He or she helps regulate what's happening in the school. They might tell you to stop running. They might give teachers suggestions on how to improve their teaching. So they're kind of controlling the everyday functions of your school, just like the nucleus controls the everyday functions of a cell. Now we're going to move on to the membrane. So the membrane, cell membrane, is also called the plasma membrane. If you ever see those, don't get confused. They mean the exact same thing. So cell membrane is the same thing as plasma membrane. This is what surrounds the cell and controls what enters and leaves the cell. It is made up of phospholipid bilayer. Plant cells have a cell wall, which is like an extra layer of protection and stability. A lot of students are like, well, if it's extra protection and stability, why don't animal cells have it? Well, the fun thing about animals, as Bruschetta is showing here, is that we move, right? And if we had cell walls on our cells, it would be a lot harder for us to move. Even though it gives that extra shape, stability, and protection, plant cells can't move. So they're different cells for different functions that these two organisms have. So in our analogy, it's like the walls and the intercom. In our school, this is like the secretary, the walls and the intercom system. They protect what is inside of the school, and they surround the school and decide what comes in and out. So if you think about it, we say a cell membrane is semi-permeable membrane, right? It lets some things in and it keeps other things out. Just like your secretary wouldn't just let anybody enter your school at any time that they wanted to. They probably have to check into the office, get an ID or a pass or whatever it is before they can go do volunteer in your classroom or help clean up something or whatever their job is. They need to pass through that secretary, and that's what the cell membrane or plasma membrane is like. Okay, next we have the lysosome. The lysosome's job is to basically keep the cell clean. It destroys and breaks down old molecules and cell parts and dissolves them. So this is kind of like the awesome custodians. If you do not appreciate your custodians, make sure you do. They're very important to your school's function. Our wonderful custodians are like the lysosomes of the cell. They keep our school clean the same way lysosomes keep the cell clean. Okay, and that's why if you ever think of Lysol, which, product mentioning in a video is probably a big no-no, but Lysol cleans, right? So the lysosome is also the cleaner of the cell. Next one we have is the mitochondria. I think mitochondria are like one of the coolest organelles. These produce the energy of the cell and is the powerhouse. Sugar and oxygen are brought here, and respiration takes place inside of the mitochondrion. In a lot of ways, the mitochondria are like a cell within a cell. So really cool story about mitochondria that I'm going to tell super quickly. So back when all living things were one cell, eventually one cell ate another cell and didn't fully digest it. And that cell that it ate became the mitochondria. And so that's why a mitochondria actually has its own DNA. It's because it's left over from this accident or thing that happened when one cell ate another cell and didn't dissolve it. And that became so successful that other multicellular organisms or eukaryotic cells started to develop those same characteristics of having these mitochondria. And the mitochondria help produce ATP or energy for the cell. And remember, energy cannot be created or destroyed, so produce might not be the right word, but they help process and give the cell the energy that it needs to function. Another fun fact about mitochondria are fascinating. Mitochondria, we believe, actually all share the same common DNA way back when, and we call that mitochondrial Eve. And that mitochondrial DNA is actually passed down through the female side of your family. So mitochondria are just really cool. There's a lot of scientific research happening with mitochondria, and that's just kind of one of the ways that this is an overview of cell organelles, but there's certainly so many more things that are fascinating about them and about the organelles and how they function. And I hope that you continue on in science and continue to learn about these organelles. Okay, so that's the mitochondria. An example or analogy to this would be the lunchroom, right? In our school, this is where we get the lunch for the day. During lunch, you as students get your ATP or your energy for the rest of the day. And I love that smiling taco emoji. Okay, next one we're going to talk about is the Golgi Apparatus. The Golgi Apparatus modifies proteins and packages them for export. So just think of it as like the packager of the cell. And if we relate this to school, this is like the copiers and computers. If we think of our work as proteins, and our computer and copiers help make our work packaged and ready for students to do this work, right? So it's really hard to do a worksheet if it's just on your computer. The copier on your teacher's computer, or if she projects it, right? The copier and the individual student computers, they help deliver that learning to you. It's not a perfect analogy, but it kind of works. All right, next organelle is the ribosomes. Ribosomes make proteins. The process where we make proteins is protein synthesis. It is pretty complex, and I always like to talk about it with my students later. But just for now, know that ribosomes are the place where proteins are made. And this is like classrooms. Again, if we think that proteins are like homework and assignments, learning at school, the ribosomes are like the classrooms of a school. That's where most of the learning takes place. All right, our next organelle is the endoplasmic reticulum. The endoplasmic reticulum, often referred to as the ER, not emergency room, carries stuff through the cell. The rough ER specifically works with proteins, and the smooth ER doesn't work with proteins. And in our analogy, and you can kind of tell when you look at a cell model, the rough ER is going to have those dots, and the smooth ER is going to look smooth, right? No dots. So those dots represent those proteins. In our analogy, this is kind of like the teacher. A lot of the teacher's job is to help students understand the material. Teachers help regulate how you get your assignments, how you receive the information that you need to be successful. So we're going to stop for a second and think, pair, share. Is every cell exactly the same? Why yes and why no? What parts of the cell do you think are most important? If you're at school, you can do this with a partner. If you're at home, make sure you write this down or think quietly to yourself. All right, moving on. The next organelle is the cytoplasm. This supports and protects the organelles. It's the stuff that fills a cell. These are where all the reactions take place. Don't think too much about the cytoplasm. Sometimes students get it all up in their head. It's really just the jelly filling that surrounds the rest of the cell, right? We have to have a name for that space, for that fluid that surrounds those cells. This is kind of like the hallways, right? The cytoplasm is a lot like the hallways of our school. It doesn't have a huge function other than it fills up the space around the other organelles, and it's the place where all the reactions take place, just like the hallways we all know are where all the social interactions mostly take place in school. Next, we have vacuoles. Vacuoles are the storage centers of a cell. They are membrane-enclosed spaces for storage. And just remember, a membrane is a thin layer that surrounds and encloses it. So vacuoles have their own tiny little membrane. Remember, membranes are semi-permeable, so they're letting some things in and some things out, and expelling things in and taking things in for the cell. They're the storage centers. So this is a lot like, lockers and backpacks. Vacuoles are kind of like lockers and storage spaces. Unlike lockers, sometimes the vacuoles move around throughout the cells, kind of like a backpack. A final note before we finish up, these are not all of the organelles. These are just some of the most commonly known and important for you to know of cells. Another organelle that we've talked about before in other videos is the chloroplast. A chloroplast is a powerhouse of a plant cell. What's confusing is that plant cells have chloroplasts and mitochondria, and their whole process of like light and dark reactions and the Krebs cycle and photosystems and all that is really complicated, but just kind of know that's the part where light is taken into the cell, and organisms cannot do photosynthesis or be autotrophs, right, making their own food, unless they have those chloroplasts. So that's kind of an overview of plant cells. The main ones you should be able to take away are nucleus, cytoplasm, and cell membrane. Those, if you don't know those by leaving this video, you really need to go back and look at those again. Thank you so much for joining me. Be sure to check out the description for all kinds of links to other activities and awesome stuff you can do to learn more about cells. And have a wonderful, awesome, fabulous scientific day. Adios.